Bart, hello. Welcome back
Hello,
to Digital
hello.
Hammurabi. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah, thanks. Nice to see you in this format.
I know, different home from usual.
Yes, great.
So we are here to talk about your course. You just recorded it. So if people find this interview interesting, they can go to bartehrman.com/Matthew to take a look and find more information. There'll be a link running across the bottom of the screen and in the video description, so you can sign up there. But this is an 8-lecture course looking at the Gospel of Matthew with all of the lectures, also access to the Q&A and then additional resources, I believe.
That's right.
So I want to take an historian's view because that's what we do. And I wanted to start with asking you, what do we know about who wrote the book of Matthew, and do we know what sources would have been used?
Yeah, we have some ideas. I mean, Matthew's obviously attributed to Matthew, who's the tax collector mentioned in Matthew chapter 9. And people since the end of the second century, since the writings of Irenaeus, who's writing in about 100 years after Matthew was written and put in circulation, about 100 years later, we have somebody saying it's this guy, Matthew. Um, the it's really unlikely. I spent an entire lecture trying to show why probably the Matthew, the tax collector mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, is not the person who wrote this book. And it's interesting, the author never says who he is. And he never speaks in the first person. He never says I did this, or never says we did that. It's always about other people, including this very passage, which people use to say Matthew wrote it. So it's Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 to 11. I just tell people, read it. Does it look to you like the author's talking about himself? And so then I talk about why people came up with Matthew, but it's probably not. And one reason it's probably not is because it's written in very high level Greek. I mean, it's not high level Greek like great Greek dramatists or something. We're not talking about Aeschylus here or Plato the philosopher or anything. It's not that level, but it's really good Greek. And we don't have any example of somebody coming out of Palestine at that time, out of Israel at the time, who would be able to do it, who wasn't the only person we have actually who wrote in the entire first century in Israel, who wrote in Greek and did a literary work in Greek, is Josephus, one person out of the entire population. So that this kind of person, Matthew, is just kind of a tax collector, probably the guy who's knocking on your door asking for you, telling you to give over your money. He's probably not capable of doing it. So we don't know. What we do know is that whoever wrote it is a follower of Jesus, who has Greek as his first language. He almost certainly was not living in Israel. He seems to be living in an urban center somewhere in the Roman Empire, but no one knows where, although there are lots of guesses. And so we know the kind of person he was. We know that he's interested, especially in Jesus' relationship to Jews and to Judaism. Presupposes probably that his own Christian community is in some kind of tension with the local Jewish community, which would presuppose a large urban area, but we don't know. You had a second question in there somewhere, but I forgot what it was.
I was just asking about sources.
Oh yeah, sources. So my lectures are predicated. The first 6 of my 8 lectures are predicated on the idea that is a well-established idea that I think just about everybody I know agrees with, that Matthew had Mark as one of his sources. That about like over 90% of Mark is reproduced in Matthew, sometimes word for word. And there are very, very good reasons that I don't really go into the course or won't go into here, but for thinking that it was Matthew who copied Mark and not the other way around. It's pretty compelling evidence. And so what I do in the course is I introduce a method of studying Matthew that's different from what most people would even probably think about doing, which is it's called a redactional analysis, doing redaction criticism. A redactor is an editor, and if you have somebody's literary production and one of the sources that he copied, then you're in really good shape because you can see how he's changed his sources. And when it comes to Matthew and Mark, you can just look at them very closely and you read how Mark gives a story and how Matthew gives the same story, and you see how Matthew's changed it. And Matthew's a lot longer. It added a bunch of stories, and you'd have to ask, well, why did Matthew add stories? If if he liked Mark the way it was, he just copied Mark. But he thought he could, probably improve it and say some other things he wanted to say. And so if you look at the changes in particular, you are given a hint about what this author's vested interests are. And because you know that the changes are things that he decided to change. And so a lot of my course is doing that, is going through looking at these various changes in Matthew to show this emphasis and that emphasis and trying to come up with how brilliant it was that the way he did it.
That actually leads very nicely into my next question, which is something that historians will usually ask when they're looking at a text. Why was it written, and what purpose was the author trying to achieve? Obviously, it's a New Testament gospel. There's an assumption that it's proclaiming the good news about Jesus Christ, but there's obviously going to be a specific perspective and way of conveying that message that Mark is using. Not Mark, Matthew is using. What then is Matthew trying to do, and what version of Jesus is he portraying here?
So, it's, on one level, historians would say, look, you can't get in the guy's head. They don't know what he's trying to do, but maybe he's trying to make money or something. Although he'd make no money on this thing because they weren't selling books. But, people come up with, but the only way to know is to look at what he does. And by the fact that he's changing Mark, boy, that sure gives you some real hints. And what I do in my course is I begin by pointing out the very first verse. Mark's gospel begins with Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. So Jesus is an adult, and it starts with the baptism when God declares to Jesus, "You are my son, in whom I'm well pleased." And usually, in all these gospels, and in actually most books of the New Testament, if you look at the beginning and you pay really close attention, you'll notice things that are going to show up repeatedly throughout the gospel. But Mark is really big on talking about Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God, and what that meant. And he begins that way. Matthew begins by giving a genealogy of Jesus, which isn't very exciting to a lot of people. But man, when you start digging into this genealogy, it's really interesting. But the way he introduces it may originally have been the title of the book. The first verse is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then he starts the genealogy, starting with Abraham. And so why does he say it's the son of David, the son of Abraham? Why not, the son of, Josiah and the son of Solomon? Why is David and Abraham? Well, David is the greatest king of the Jews, whose descendant was to be the Messiah. Abraham was the father of the Jews. And this whole genealogy is set up to show Jesus' Jewishness in such a way as to show that Jesus is actually, in a subtle way that doesn't come out and say, but I explain this in the lecture, it shows that Jesus is the fulfillment of the entire plan of God for Israel. In the genealogy, he shows this. And so, yeah, so I think part of what he's trying to do is he's trying to emphasize the Jewishness of Jesus more than Mark. Mark has no problem with Jesus being Jewish, but I mean, Matthew's emphasizing that Jesus is the fulfillment of Judaism, and yet he is more vitriolic against Jewish leaders and Judaism as it's practiced in his day than Mark is. And so the big key for trying to understand Matthew is how he can be both the most Jewish gospel and the most anti-Jewish gospel. How's that work? And so those are the kinds of themes I play out through these talks.
Thank you. And Matthew, throughout, especially the first part of the gospel, really isn't shy about pointing out where Jesus fulfills Jewish prophecies. And I think the first is all of 23 verses into the gospel when Jesus is born of a virgin, which goes back to Isaiah. What kind of impression would this prophecy fulfillment create for readers, especially when so many of the examples come early on?
Yeah, it's he's got a number of these citations, and where he literally says something like this happened to fulfill what the prophet so and so said, or this happened to fulfill the prophecy, that phrasing. So scholars talk about these as fulfillment citations, where they're specific to Matthew. You don't get it in Mark, and you don't get it in Luke or John either. But these specific ways of phrasing this, and about half of them are in the birth narrative. So Jesus is born in Bethlehem to fulfill what the prophet said about virgin birth, about being born in Bethlehem and born a virgin to fulfill a virgin. And he goes to Egypt because the prophet said, "Out of Egypt I'll call my son." He does boom, 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 and so he's just right off the bat, he's trying to show that the life of Jesus was not just kind of some kind of accidental life that some guy was born and had a pretty good life and had a lot of followers until he got on the wrong side of the law. The whole point is this thing is fulfilling scripture up and down the line, and so he hits you over the head with it to begin with.
So do you think Matthew either believed or intended his audience to believe that Jesus was truly fulfilling prophecy, or are these statements more about showing his essential nature, like you might see in a Greek or Roman biography?
I'd say both. I think Matthew absolutely believes it. I mean, we don't know what he believes. I mean, maybe he was a Buddhist at heart. We don't know. I mean, could be, possibly, but I mean, but it doesn't seem likely. I think he really thought this stuff. I think he thought Jesus really was fulfilling these scriptures, and he thought Jesus really was the Messiah. But the point you make about Greco-Roman biographies is a really good one that people don't really know as much about. But in Greek and Roman biographies, when Plutarch, for example, is writing a biography of Alexander the Great, um, he begins by talking about stuff. If he talks about childhood stuff, it's always to show that the characteristics of this person in childhood are reflections of what's going to happen when he's an adult. So most people know what he's kind of like as an adult, but to understand this, really, you got to see what he was like as a kid. And so the childhood stories function to reveal the person's character. They could do this in the ancient world because they didn't have our sense of psychological development in the kind of pre-Freudian age. They didn't think in terms of like what kind of formative influences did they have. It was more that you're born a certain way, and who you are is set at birth. So what you do early on reflects what's going to happen later on. And so that's what happens with this. So the fact that Jesus is fulfilling prophecy already, the fact that his mother calls him Jesus because he's going to save his people from their sins, that's all right there at the beginning. And the coming out of Egypt is reflecting the Exodus event, which is a salvation event for Jews. Jesus is a salvation event for all people. All of that stuff's in the first two chapters, which means if you pay really close attention to the first two chapters, you have a pretty good sense of what Matthew's going to do in this gospel.
So, given that Matthew is spending so much time painting Jesus as a particularly Jewish Messiah and the fulfillment of all these prophecies, why is it that you get so much kind of vitriolic criticism of Jewish leadership coming through in Matthew?
Yeah, it's quite pronounced. The most famous passage is in chapter 23, where Jesus on 7 times says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees." And I don't think that was kind of like what we might say when we're having a bad day. Woe is me. This is like an apocalyptic woe, like, oh man, you're going to be wiped out. And it's because they're such hypocrites. It's really, here's one of the really interesting things in Matthew that, again, people don't notice. Jesus insists that his followers keep the Jewish law and that they keep it better than the scribes and Pharisees. He says that in chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. And then right before he starts blasting away at these Pharisees and scribes in chapter 23, he's talking to his disciples, and he says the scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do what they tell you, but don't practice what they practice. And so the problem with these people is they don't practice what they preach. But what they preach is fine for Matthew. Wow. I thought Jesus came to get rid of all that stuff, right? I thought he was like, he doesn't want Christians to keep the Jewish law, right? Yeah, now if you read Matthew, he does want Christians to keep the Jewish law. And so one of the things I have to do in my course is to try and figure out if he really means that, like, in the sense that Gentiles, to be followers of Jesus, have to become Jews. Do men have to get circumcised? Do people have to keep kosher food laws? Do they have to observe the Sabbath? Or does he have a different thing in mind? And so that is one of the really intriguing parts of Matthew it's difficult to figure it out, but I try to lay it out in the course.
Has this impacted at all, or maybe how has this impacted Jewish-Christian relationships through the centuries?
Yeah, well, Matthew has not impacted them very well through the centuries, I will say that, especially because it's not just the Jewish leaders that Matthew goes after. There's one passage in particular that it really has been used for horrific anti-Jewish purposes and now modern period anti-Semitic purposes. It's when Jesus is on trial before Pontius Pilate. Again, when I talk about this in the course, I compare what Matthew says with what Mark had said. And one of the things Matthew does is that he elevates the innocence of Pontius Pilate in the condemnation of Jesus. The scribes and the scribes and the chief priests want Jesus to be crucified, and Pilate says, "Look, he hasn't done anything wrong." Is what Pilate's wife says. Look, comes and says to him, "Look, I've had a bad dream all night about this guy. He's a righteous man. Don't do anything to him." And so you get that, and then Pilate finally he feels, he's got to do it because the chief priest has riled up the crowd and they're crying out. So he calls for a basin of water and he washes his hands and he says, "I'm innocent of this man's blood." So this is only in Matthew. You don't get it in Mark or the other Gospels. But then when Pilate says that in Matthew, in chapter 27, verse 25, the crowd cries out, "His blood be upon us and our children." And it's not, and when Matthew says this, he doesn't say the crowd cries out. He says the entire people, meaning the people of the Jews, "His blood be upon us and our children." In other words, they take the responsibility for Jesus' death and they pass it on to their descendants and our children. And so this is the verse that was used to begin calling Jews Christ killers. And some Jew says, "Well, what I got to do with that? I wasn't even alive. His blood be upon us and our children." So it like continues on. And so this was used, boy, man, through the Middle Ages, still is used today for horrible purposes. And yeah, I don't think Matthew's Matthew's complicated when it comes to anti-Judaism, but he's certainly not anti-Semitic. He has no problem. I mean, Jesus is a Jew in Matthew. And so his followers are very Jewish and they're supposed to be Jewish. They're supposed to keep the Jewish law. But man, the crowd that rejects Jesus, yeah, he doesn't treat them well.
Well, thank you so much, Bart. And audience, if that sounds interesting to you, if you would like to find out more detail, go into this in more depth, then please do check out Bart's course. And we will see you all next time.